With the Edmonton Oilers set to take on the Florida Panthers in the Stanley Cup Final beginning on Saturday, it's important to know your history.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I've been doing digital hockey content for almost a full decade now. God, am I old. But before we get to today's episode, gotta remind you, it's brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I want to thank everybody tuning in, making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Today's show, this is for me. If you're familiar, I've been doing the show now almost 2 full months. I got tagged in on an interim basis to help fill in the gap here. And like Chris Knobloch, I'm hoping this results in a Stanley Cup. And I'm a history nerd. I love understanding how things have gone in the past because they generally can give you a baseline understanding of the present, where you're going. In today's episode, there's going to be quite a bit of conversation about that. We're going to talk about recent Stanley Cups at large, not including the Oilers and the Panthers, but that'll be a little bit later on. We're going to start out very straightforward. The path to get here and what that typically looks like and what types of components you would see on a team that goes all the way. We're going to talk about it from both an Oilers and the Panthers perspective, so I'm not just giving you the rosy-eyed view. We're going to touch base on how these rosters came together. Florida, a little bit unorthodox in comparison to some of the recent Stanley Cup contenders, but nevertheless, they're here for the second year in a row, so they must be doing something right. And then, like I said before, we are going to wrap up talking about recent Stanley Cup history and why, even though you might want to pick the Oilers in 7, you might have a better chance of them winning in 5 or 6. So let's get on into it. First of all, they're here. Before we start picking apart, microanalyzing, trying to figure out every last detail, the Oilers are here. First Stanley Cup Final appearance in 18 years. First time with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. This is not the end goal. This was not the mission when they set out at the beginning of training camp back in September. It was not. It was not just to make the Stanley Cup Final. I understand the goal is to bring that trophy home to Alberta, to Edmonton. I do. Take this all in. I've said this a lot over the last few weeks. I said this just getting to the conference finals against Dallas. You don't get here that often. It is really difficult to get here. And maybe the Oilers are about to enter their golden age window. Maybe they're going to have an opportunity like the Kings of last decade, like the Blackhawks, like the Lightning of this decade, where they're going to make 2 finals in 4 years and have a chance at winning multiple championships. Maybe. But you do not have any guarantees. You do not know what the team will look like after this season. So you got to live in the moment. And the most famous last words in all of professional sports are, they will be back. There are quite a few teams we could talk about in the hockey space and the basketball space. The basketball space in particular jumps out at me because certain ones are really crazy. Like, you talk about that OKC team that went to the finals against the Heat with Westbrook, Durant, and James Harden, and those guys all ended up going different places. You could talk about it from a hockey perspective with the Blues winning the Stanley Cup. You could talk about it with the Bruins losing in that Stanley Cup final as well. You might be talking about it with the Avalanche in regards to the team that won the Stanley Cup 2 years ago. That core, Makar, McKinnon, Rantanen are great, but beyond that, they don't have the horses you would think to sustain a long-term window. But one thing I did want to touch on in this opening segment, your path to getting to the final matters, and more so than just getting here. What your path says about how you got here and what it means about going forward, I do think there is something to that. I think the fact that both of these teams have played pretty comparable amount of games, Florida's played one fewer than the Oilers, so this shouldn't be a massive rest and fatigue and tired situation yet. As the series goes along, that may change, but one game should not be a massive gap. I have long said you need to finish at least two, if not all three, of your pre-Stanley Cup Final series and less than 6 games if you want a serious chance to win the Stanley Cup. Stanley Cup winners typically only play 21 or 22 total playoff games. That means only 2 or 3 losses. That doesn't. If you are going to win 16, which it takes to win the Stanley Cup, and you're playing 22, 23 games, that means 2-3 losses, at most 3 losses in a round. Obviously, you can only have 3 losses in a round if you make the Stanley Cup Final, but you get what I'm saying from a math perspective here. You want to have as little wear and tear and as little fatigue as possible. The Oilers in Florida are both relatively healthy. There are some injuries. There are some question marks about who may or may not be available in certain spots, how dinged up certain guys are. But for the most part, these teams have their star power. They have their starters. Sure, maybe a 10th, 11th, 12th forward or a 6th D might change depending on the situation. But for the most part, these teams are pretty healthy. The fact that Florida has a Game 7 under their belt, that the Oilers have a Game 7 under their belt, I think that helps them. I think that's the other component of this path. You want to face some real adversity on your way to winning a Stanley Cup. And typically that adversity is going to come with the 7-game series, which you don't want because you don't want those extra miles. But in mental preparedness, I think you want to have at least one difficult playoff series on your way to the final, because I think that helps you harden your mentality and really get locked into a mental position where you understand what it's going to take. The Panthers definitely had to work for it against the Rangers, against the Bruins, but it never really felt like the Bruins were going to win that series. I know they had some chances, and I lament saying this now in hindsight because I was so optimistic going into Game 5, walking into Madison Square Garden for Game 5 against the Panthers. Looking at it back now, I don't know how I thought the Rangers were going to win 2 more games. I mean, they just didn't have the puck. If anything, I think the fact that the Oilers just came out of a more difficult series against Dallas than Florida against the Rangers, I think that helps the Oilers. I think you want to play better competition. I think you want to develop good habits. I think you want to understand where exactly you need to be in your game. And I think you have a strong argument the Oilers are peaking at the exact right time. Now, the fact that there's a whole week of layoff between Game 6 against Dallas and the start of the Cup Final, that momentum, that confidence, that smoothness to their game, it probably won't be there, especially because Game 1s, especially first periods of Game 1s, are typically a feeling out process. It's 2 dance partners trying to figure out if the other one knows the cadence to the movement or not. And when you don't know, you're going to err on the side of caution, because if this series goes the way people think it will, which at least 6 games, and we're going to talk more about that coming up next, but on a baseline, these 2 teams have had really similar paths. The Oilers really sweated it against Vancouver. You would say the Panthers sweated it against the Rangers, but they never trailed in that series. They did trail 2-1 in that series, but it never really felt like the Rangers were going to be able to pull away without something weird happening, without Florida giving them something. So we're going to take a quick break, come back. We're going to talk about the rosters, how they got put together, draft picks, trades, whatever. Coming up next on Locked On Oilers. It is busy season. It's summer. The concert circuit is heating up. We got the NBA Finals, Mavericks and Celtics, Game 1 tonight. Kyrie Irving back in Boston. Got the NHL Stanley Cup Final. Your Edmonton Oilers taking on the Florida Panthers. If you want to get in on the action, buy some tickets, go to a game, the only app you should be using is Game Time, which features some of the best tools in the ticket space. things like all-in pricing where you can see the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkouts. My personal favorite, the seat view, where you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. If you're going to a concert, you don't want a speaker, you don't want a pole in front of you, you want to see the performer. The lowest price guarantee or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Game Time ticket coverage, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the industry. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA and NHL Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. I want to thank everybody who's making Locked On Oilers a part of your Thursday, whether it is first thing in the morning, on the way to work, on the way to school, on the way to the gym, or at the end of the day, on the way home, or if you're a workout in the evening type person. I'm glad you're getting ready for the Stanley Cup Finals with us. This has been a really fun journey. It's always great getting to immerse yourself in a different team, and it gives you a better understanding. And that's ultimately my goal here. I want to understand hockey as much as I possibly can. That's, like a scientist saying, I want to understand science. You're never going to totally know everything because it's constantly changing. And frankly, we don't understand it well enough statistically, analytically, to be able to understand it entirely. So we have our theories. We test our theories based on what we're able to measure, and we go from there. So getting immersed in another team has been a really rewarding experience. And I feel like I've learned quite a bit about how the Oilers are so good. Excuse me there, I had to take a sip of water, a little bit on the tired side. So, my personal favorite thing to do when we're talking about Stanley Cups, conference finals, I love analyzing how these rosters get put together because I like using history to be able to frame what teams are doing in the present. So, we're going to talk about the Panthers and the Oilers rosters here in a second, how they were assembled. We're going to use that framework with the mindset of, okay, if I'm team X and it's July 1st, what are we doing that's setting us up for success? Are we doing what other successful teams have done? Or are we trying to forge a different path and be a little bit different? Being different is not necessarily bad, but I do think people who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it. I often say you can't win the Stanley Cup on July 1st, and the Panthers may be putting a test to that because of some of the moves they've made, but you can certainly lose the Stanley Cup on July 1st. You give Tyler Myers a top-of-market, unrestricted free agent defenseman contract. You give David Backes, if you're a Bruins, if you remember the Bruins overpaying for David Backes, who scored 30 goals, and then his back gave out, and he was never the same player again. What former Ranger you want to talk about? You want to do Bobby Holik? You want to do Brad Richards? Whichever one you want to talk about of expensive player. And that's the thing with free agency. You're always going to pay a little bit more than a player's worth. I call it the free agency tax, where you're going to pay $1.5 million more than what a player's production is worth, just because guys don't get to free agency that often. So it's their duty to get as much as they possibly can. So that brings us, we'll start with Florida, because being that this is an Oilers podcast, I'm going to assume you understand where the vast majority of the players on your team came from. The thing that's unique about Florida, the vast majority of their team is outsourced. They only have 3 draft picks and they're starting guys. Barkov, Lundell, Aaron Ekblad. That's it. Of their 18 skaters and Bobrovsky, only 3 are draft picks. That's very unorthodox. And granted, Ekblad, he's not a number 1. He's probably not a number 2, but because he plays with Forsling, he can be a number 2. He's a really solid defenseman. Barkov, I think, has cemented himself as one of the 10 best players in the world in these playoffs. And then Lundell is a really overqualified third center who very well could blossom into a 2C. And then maybe, 5 years from now, when Barkov's a little bit older, maybe Lundell is the Barkov replacement down the road for them. But the vast majority of this roster, you talk about Kachuk, Sam Bennett, these are trades. And staking your job on a trade like Huberdeau and Uyghur for Matthew Tkachuk is gutsy. Bill Zito deserves the credit he got for pulling that trade off. At the time, I felt like it would help Calgary more because I was really high on Huberdeau and Uyghur was an ascending player. Whereas Tkachuk, I wasn't positive. He was entirely his own thing. You got to remember he was coming off the season where he spent the entire year playing with Johnny Gaudreau, who had 120 points, and Elias Lindholm, who had 100 points that season as well. So I wasn't totally sure Tkachuk was his own entity. Obviously, with 2 years of evidence, we now know that Matthew Tkachuk is his own creator. He doesn't need help. And then you go down the list, you get waiver claims like Carter Verhaeghe and Gustav Forsling, where guys undervalued in other situations, and the for whatever reason, the Panthers looked at them and saw opportunity. I think a guy like him, I think a guy like Evan Rodriguez, who's bounced around a handful of teams, but always has his speed and his size, even if his shot isn't as good as it might have been in the past, or he can't get the bounces he did maybe in other stops like Pittsburgh. He's a plus skater and he's big. You can figure out the rest when you've got those traits. And then they got the most expensive goalie in the league in Sergei Bobrovsky, which that's one of those July 1st moves you probably wouldn't want to replicate if you're another team. If you're, say, the Devils, or you're, say, the Kings, or the Senators. You know, the Senators did learn their lesson. They signed Jonas Korpisalo, who not making nearly as much as Bob, but wholly detrimental to their team. And then real quick, we'll bounce over to the Oilers. Significantly more drafted players, you know, McDavid, Draisaitl, Broberg, Bouchard, Nuge, Stuart Skinner, originally a draft pick as well. Darnell Nurse, originally a draft pick. But the vast majority of this team is internal. And they had some good free agent signings work out for them. Zach Hyman is a home run. Every single general manager in the league wishes they could sign an underutilized player, slide him into their top 6, and get 50-goal seasons. That does not happen all that often. I'm going to go and do the math on it, and I'll come back and I'll report back tomorrow what players who've changed teams in unrestricted free agency who've gone on to have 50-goal seasons. Can't be that many because there aren't that many 50-goal seasons, and teams typically don't let 50-goal guys leave. So you can't do someone like a Brett Hull or something like that because, guys like that bounced around a little bit more back in the day. But in today's salary cap world, it's different. And then interesting decisions, you know, guys like Cody Ceci, who are here to do one specific thing that they are good at and only that. I think you look at guys like Warren Fogle, who was a trade, and then Adam Henrique, obviously, Sam Carrick, who was a trade, Corey Perry, a free agent, Vander Kane, a free agent. The Oilers have had to tinker on the margins because they're so cap strapped, because they're up against that ceiling, because they have 2 of the 5 best players in the world. And that makes it hard to change your roster all that much. So you have to constantly be changing on the periphery. We will be right back. We'll talk about recent Stanley Cup Final history, what it might mean for the Oilers, what it might mean for the Panthers. So stick around. Coming up next on Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Hello, everyone. Thank you very, very much for hanging around on this third segment. Tomorrow, we're going to have crossover with the Florida Panthers with Locked On Panthers with Armando. That will be a very fun conversation. Looking forward to getting an outside perspective on the Panthers going into their series, even though I feel like I'm pretty well versed in them, being that I just watched the Rangers die death by 1,000 cuts against them. So, recent Stanley Cup history. You might be saying to yourself, well, what does recent Stanley Cup history have to do with the Oilers right now? And it might not have anything to do with the Oilers right now. It really might not. They might be the 1 in 5 to 10 year type team. That's the question here. When you look at recent NHL history, and I'm pulling up the spreadsheet I had made earlier, I can't say historically, but in recent NHL history, the vast majority of Stanley Cup Finals are a team beating down on a team that is physically hitting a wall. And that doesn't mean the team that's hitting the wall isn't talented, isn't good, didn't deserve to be there. It just means that the team that wins really has been emphatic in winning in recent NHL history. Last year, Vegas wins in 5 games. The year before that, Colorado wins in 6 games. The year before that, Tampa Bay wins in 5. The year before that, Tampa Bay wins in 6. Most recent Game 7, 2019, Blues over Bruins. Bruins didn't get off the bus in Game 7. They lost a game that was winnable, and they got jobbed by the referees. Noel Acciari got tripped. I have no qualms about saying the Bruins probably deserve better. I don't think it's really an argument that the Bruins weren't a more talented team than the Blues. They were. They flat out were. But they didn't win, so it doesn't matter. And then, not the Lightning, the Capitals, they beat Vegas in 5. That Washington team, deep. That Vegas team, very clear, hit a wall. That Braden Holtby save, and I believe that was Game 2. That swung the series. Vegas had won Game 1. Holtby makes that crazy save. That gets them back in it. And then Washington wins 4 straight, and that changes things. Pittsburgh wins both of their cups in 6. Chicago beats Tampa Bay in 6. The Kings beat the Rangers in 5. The Blackhawks beat the Bruins in 6. The Kings beat the Devils in 6. The second most recent Game 7, Boston beats Vancouver in 7. Chicago beats Philly in 6. Pittsburgh, Detroit in 7. Detroit, Pittsburgh in 6. A lot of these cup finals of the last 15, 20 years are 5 or 6 games because the team that gets there, that's more physically taxed, that hits that wall, they're running into a team that is peaking simultaneously. So it's a double whammy of situational factors. We talk about score effects and the Oilers and how Stuart Skinner plays so much better with the lead as opposed to when they're playing from behind. And man, you get out to a lead, that changes things very, very fundamentally for the Oilers' calculus as a team. It gives them so many more opportunities because Skinner's not pressing, because he's a little more on his toes. He's a little bit more, I don't need to make every save, which makes him better. But I know your instinct is going to be to say Oilers in 7 because you want to be respectful to the Panthers. You want to say the Oilers are really good, but I think they're going to win this series. But you don't want to disrespect the Panthers, and you're going to say Oilers in 7. There have been 2 Stanley Cup Final Game 7s since 2010. We're not due just yet. You had 2011 Bruins Canucks, and then you had 2019 Bruins Blues. The Bruins are not in this series, so based on statistics, that helps. And then you're probably looking at a Game 7 2 or 3 years from now. I did my official prediction. The graphic's going to go out sometime today on Thursday. Hunter Hodes and I are going to break down the series on the Locked On NHL Power Ranking show. We're going to give our official series picks. You know who I'm picking. I'm going to pick the Oilers in 7. Whether you listen to this or see that or see the crossover with Armando, whichever one you see it first, I am going to take one for the team and pick the Oilers in 7 and hope that translates them to winning in 6 because they're peaking at the right time. And maybe Florida's a little bit more dinged up, maybe a little bit more physically tired from going to the Stanley Cup Final last year, even though they only lasted 5 games. That stuff matters. I know we're kind of in the weeds and we're talking about more game theory stuff than the actual series itself. You got to consider every factor you can that's going to give you an advantage in understanding what's going to happen. Is history a forecaster? Is it going to tell you what's going to happen? No. Can it give you clues? Can you see similarities? Yes. And that's the beauty of knowing it and understanding it and appreciating it. It opens a better understanding of the world around you. And in this case, for the Oilers, you're probably going to win this series in 6 games if you're going to win this series, which that would mean winning on home ice, which I'm not jinxing anything. If you're the superstitious here, that's me knocking on my desk just for you, just in case you think I'm being disrespectful or not fearing the hockey gods enough. I understand the fear. I'm knocking on wood for you. I did it again just to be sure. I think the Oilers are situated well. I think they are starting to peak at the right time. I'm very much looking forward to getting to work. This series should be awesome. These are 2 awesome teams loaded with stars on both sides. If you haven't watched a lot of the Panthers, Barkov and McDavid playing cat and mouse for hopefully 6-7 games is going to be incredible hockey. I can't wait to see how the coaches try and dictate the matchups, especially when they don't have home ice. Are we going to see Paul Maurice use Barkov to try and erase McDavid and not worry about offense so much from them? Are we going to see the Lundell line out there and more of a shot suppressing, take chances away from McDavid role? That's the conundrum and why this is so fun. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcast. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please be so kind, leave the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit that alarm bell, leave me a comment. What do you think the most important thing for the Oilers in this series against the Panthers is? Is it a specific player, a specific matchup? Is it Chris Knobloch outfoxing Paul Maurice? You let me know what you think the key for the Oilers is. I will talk to you guys tomorrow with Armando. Until then, let's go Oilers.